Hi friends, Brooke here, and I am pretty excited to bring you this week's tutorial. So every month to my email subscribers, I send out a freebie, and this is this month's freebie. And I love black and white. If you follow me over on Instagram, black and white makes a feature in a lot of my work, whether it's black and white on its own or it goes with every single color. So it is so easy to use, in my opinion. You can get so much depth and dimension just with black and white. So I wanted to do a freebie with different marks that I had made, and I put them together on the computer, kind of overlapped them, and I thought this would be really fun. So I had a couple different ideas for the tutorial for this freebie. One was just to use this as a collage sheet of paper, rip it up and use it for collage. All of these marks are really fun and kind of built in. But then I thought, let's do something a little bit more in depth, and I want to take you along for creating a little journal. So this is a handmade journal. We're going to keep the inside pretty simple, but with all different kinds of paper. But first step here is I want to doctor up my little cover here, add some art marks, add some little fun bits, nothing extreme. So what I'm doing is just taking some different mark making utensils. We have pencil, China marker, white correction pen, nothing super fancy here. And I'm following the cues that are already on this page. So that just means that have the circle shape or the oval shape. Maybe I'm starting by just kind of tracing around it loosely with my pencil, going back in over some of the dashes and making them more bold. If you do it in one spot, it doesn't mean you have to do it over that entire shape of design, but we're just making that printout feel more handmade. We're making it feel a little bit more textured, and like with this cheap ballpoint pen, I'm creating indentations in it when I go around these circles, and then bringing out those marks into other areas as well. So going beyond where the original marks were and just adding on to it. It's going to create a cohesion between what was already there and what you're adding. And so I'm telling myself not to go too crazy on this. I actually really like the printout how it is. It's kind of simple but complex at the same time. I didn't want to overlap too many of the patterns when I did this, but I wanted to show how interesting marks can be when we start layering them up and overlapping them. So I thought this would be the perfect sheet to use just for the cover of this little journal I'm making. And digital downloads are such an easy start to that. I've actually been using them more and more in my work now that I offer them as freebies to my subscribers. And by the way, it's free to get on that email list. I will put the link in the description below, along with all of the supplies that I'm using. And even if you're not an email subscriber yet, you can still get this freebie. So that link will be down below as well. So don't worry, you're not missing out on anything. I'm keeping it really simple. I could cut this down to a smaller size, but I'm just folding it in half the long way and then the short way. And this is going to be my cover here. It's going to act as if it's a double-sided sheet of paper printed on both sides. You'll see here, I'm going to put this together. And then now I'm actually going to stitch around the outside of this. You can glue these together first if you want to. I'm not going to. I'm trying to move a little bit quicker and not overthink my decision. So that's a conscious effort that I'm trying to make. Sometimes I can get a little bit too perfectionistic and worry about the little details. So for this, I'm just trying to move at a nice pace that feels comfortable, and I'm not getting into my head too much. So I sewed around the outside, and that's going to be my cover. And now I just gathered some papers. I always gather way too many, so you do not need as many as I'm gathering here, but I wanted a nice variety. So a couple different things that you can think about is I have different textures and colors. I grabbed black paper, white, music note paper, notebook paper, dictionary, craft paper that's brown, vellum, which is see-through, which is what I'm working on right here, from old books and car manuals, graph paper. So your options are really open for what you can use. So try to think a little bit outside the box. If you have old books that you can use, tear some of those pages out, or just look around your office supplies and even manila folders. All of that works really well for journals like this. Overall, I'm keeping things simple though. I'm not including any papers that already have artwork in them, and that's just a decision I made for this one. Most of my other journals that I create, I include handmade papers that I've had already done artwork on, but I wanted a fun journal that had interesting pages in it, but is relatively a blank slate for me to work into. So up front here, I did not know how many pieces of paper I wanted. So I just kind of started ripping, and I end up having 22 pieces of paper in my book. Just for reference, I didn't think I would want that many, but I have a hard time stopping and deciding exactly what I want here when I do choose my papers. So if you're better about editing that down from the beginning, you kind of know how many I'm using, and that's not 22 different kinds of paper. I have, for example, I had 3 graph sheets. I don't remember if I end up using them all, but in here, like white paper, I don't need the 22 different kinds. We're just trying to look a little bit for some variety. So I just looked through my stash already and was just kind of seeing what I had. If your papers are too long, feel free to fold them back into a pocket, or too wide. I'm doing a little pocket here, and just keeping it really simple though overall. I'm trying not to overthink. I'm going with the flow. I'm having some torn edges, freeform torn, others I'm using my ruler to tear. You can definitely use a paper trimmer if you like a more clean cut, or an X-Acto knife and a ruler. All of those are really good options, and so I'm just going to go through this stack. I'm essentially just taking one of every paper that I grabbed, because I grabbed way too many, and keeping in mind that I do want a little bit of a variety. All right, so I have all of my papers and I'm going to start putting them in order. I have about 27 here when it's all said and done. And you can see I even wrote on my thing that I had 27 and that was too many. I thought this was going to be way too many pages for this journal and I ended up doing 22. So go with whatever feels good to you. Some journals I put a lot less pages in so that I can add bulk later on. As a mixed media artist, I tend to add a lot of bulk and I like to add fabrics and stitching, chipboard, all of that good stuff. The nice thing about this little journal, the closure that I'll be putting on it allows room for expansion. And that's probably one of my number one tips when it comes to journal making is allow room for expansion when you start working in your journal. There's nothing more disappointing when you're working in it and you run out of room. It's not going to close anymore, but you still have empty pages. So it's just something to think about with your closures, and that can look like a variety of different things for how you do that. I never do any two closures exactly the same. I kind of just build them each time based on whatever that journal is calling for. So I'm going through and putting my pages essentially in a random order. Now, I can never be truly random because my thoughts and my brain gets in the way. But what I'm doing here is just making sure that there's a nice variety in the order. I'm not putting any two pages that are exactly alike next to each other, total personal preference. I only had two of those craft color pieces of paper, so I made sure that that had some separation between them. I think you get the idea. I'm just going random here. I could definitely take more time with this if I wanted to and really think about how I wanted things, but I want some of the whimsy left in there. I don't want to spend too much time overthinking. This is meant to be a quickly made journal that gets you working in it faster. You can also do the same technique with a cover that you worked harder on that is maybe a special piece of artwork to you that's not a digital download. Feel free to adapt this however works best for you. You can also take other digital downloads that I offer, either paid or I offer a ton of free ones. The links are both down below again, and you can just totally doctor it up to a way that really fits for you. This is a nice way to just get a quick journal that is essentially plain but has good starting points with the inspiration that's already going to be on these pages. So here I'm pretty happy with this. I kind of lined things up how I wanted as I went along. Essentially all of these are the same height, but I didn't measure. You saw I was just using my cover as my template to make sure I wasn't going any bigger than that. On this front piece here, I do want to be able to see that graphed paper behind the black. I think it just looks really pretty. And I think that black paper looks really stunning with the printable as well. So now I'm going to bind it and I'm just going to use a really simple 3-hole stitch pamphlet binding. It's probably the easiest type of stitch binding that you can do. I'm putting this all in one signature. I didn't want to mess with having to build like a spine into that journal cover where I was doing more than one signature. I'm keeping it really simple. I have a template here with my 3 holes from a previous journal, and you can see it's a little bit small, but I'm just going with it, making it work. You can also just eye your measurements. You don't need to have this measured out like I do. I just happen to have that template, and sometimes if the holes are off, it bothers me, which is a really funny thing because I'm really messy in a lot of my other artwork, but sometimes those standards just come out in me. So I just took a template that I already had, poking those 3 holes. I'm using a book cradle here, which really helps me to poke through all of my papers at once. I used to use a crocodile, which is a great option as well, but you can only do a few papers at a time, and I found that my holes would end up not being perfectly lined up, but you can see when I poke these holes that they are perfectly on that fold, and I would like to say it's because I'm a really good bookbinder, but I think the book cradle is really, really helpful. My husband just made this one out of a piece piece of wood and basically just cut a V into it. But I know that you can get them off Amazon, and I'll actually tag down below. I have not purchased it because I have this one, but Dee Dee over at Wow Studios sells one, and it looks like really great quality. So if you're in the market for one, I'm not an affiliate with her, but I think that all of her other products are absolutely amazing. And so I will link that down below also. Okay, so I'm just lining up my cover with my pages, and I used my awl there just to make sure everything was lined up. And now I'm going to get to the binding part, and I'm keeping this really simple. Usually I used a waxed thread for the binding, but I had an idea on this one. I wanted it to feel a bit messier, and so I'm using just regular DMC embroidery floss. I'm putting it through this little wax here to make it a little bit easier to bind with. And my main reason for doing that is the knot at the end, if it has some wax on it, will stay better and not loosen as much over time. So if all you have is embroidery thread, the wax is a great option, but you can also honestly just use just the embroidery thread on its own, and that will be fine. So I'm going to start here and thread my needle. And I have a little bit bigger of a needle than normal to fit through those holes. But one tip I will say, if you have trouble getting through all of your holes at one time, is make sure your needle isn't too big. Most of the needles that come in my bookbinding kit were quite massive. And it makes it a little bit harder, I think, to go through all of them. So I am starting on the outside, which is not always the regular option, but I want that knot to show on the outside. So if you start on the inside, the knot will be buried in the inside. If you start on the outside, your knot will be on the outside, if that makes sense. So since I wanted that little bit messier of a look, I'm starting on the outside, and then I'll actually end up separating those threads out so it's more fun. So I start in that middle hole, and then I go up one to the next hole. I'm back on the outside. I'm going to skip over that middle hole that I've already been in and go in the bottom hole. I'll go from the outside to the inside, get that needle through. You can take a little bit of finagling there. And then I'm going to go back up through the middle hole, which is where I started. It's really a simple technique here. And especially when you're just doing the 3 holes, it makes for a really nice and fast binding. My threads, I'm just making sure that one comes up on one side of the thread and the other on the other side. Now, I end up changing my binding as we go along here, but I'm using the exact same technique. I end up not liking the look on the outside, the bow that I create, only because I think it clashes with the closure later on. But I left in this footage because the binding is exactly the same. I just end up taking it out and moving it to the inside, which is an added step. And as much as you try to plan and just go with the flow, sometimes you do have to make revisions. So I'm just knotting this thread here a couple of times, making sure that it's going to stay. And then I'm going to, you can just do it in a knot like this, but I want to end up doing it in a little bow. And this is kind of funny, but since I want that messy look, I'm actually going to separate all of these threads before I tie it in a bow. And it's just going to make it a bit more scraggly looking. Now that my book is secure, I'm going to think about my closure. I'm going to put this jumbo paper clip here just to hold those inside pages together so I'm not having to deal with it trying to open on me. And I don't have my closure fully planned out. So I'm going to play around here and see what I think looks best. I'm thinking something simple with just some black sari ribbon, but I'm going to play around and see if anything else jumps out at me. A lot of times our first instinct is the one that we go with, but it can be really fun to try to think a little bit outside the box, see what you have on hand, and if you can use it in some way. Ultimately, I decide that since the cover already has quite a bit going on with the small marks, that I'm going to keep this closure simple. And it's kind of funny because I had really debated what side of the cover was going to be the outside front. And eventually I do end up switching because I like my closure so much. You'll see here. So what I'm going to do is I need to attach the sari ribbon to the cover. You could do this in multiple ways. Most of the time I would put it so it's just on the inside and kind of hidden, but I thought it would be really fun to make it kind of a feature element. And as of now, I'm thinking this is going to be the back cover, and it's just going to be like a fun little thing as I go along here. So I'm layering up some of that fabric, so it's not just the sari ribbon, and that's just for aesthetic purposes. I like the look of those layers together. And then I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and kind of go back and forth a little bit with some straight stitches, or you could use a zigzag stitch. I made it really messy there, and that's nice and secure. For a little bit of embellishment, I'm going to add a black safety pin to it. If you don't have a sewing machine, feel free just to glue that on or attach it just with the safety pin. The safety pin also acts as an attachment method. For me, I'm just using it aesthetically, but feel free to use that fully functional step as well. So I'm just putting that on there, and I like the look of it. And now I'm going to see what this looks like all wrapped up. Now the binding threads, I never intended for them to stay that long, but I left them this long up until now because I kept debating if I was going to put any beads or anything on it. So it was easier just to leave them long and then decide versus cutting them short and then regretting that I had them too short. So as I'm wrapping this around, I'm realizing it's going to cover what I just did. And it ended up being a lot cuter sewn on than I thought it would be. I wasn't trying to make a real feature element. I was just trying to jazz it up a little bit and get a little funky with the way that I sewed the sari ribbon on. And so this is me kind of battling in my mind now of, can I make it work still, keeping the front cover how I intended it? Should I flip this around so that becomes the front cover? It's kind of hard when things don't go directly as planned because you find yourself fighting internally a little bit like, oh, but it's supposed to be that way. Well, we have to remember we're the ones making the rules. So it's okay to switch things up. And if something ends up looking better another way, just lean into it and try it out and see how it goes. It's funny because I do end up switching this to the opposite direction. And those pages that I had like a pocket in are actually now going to be upside down, but that's okay. I didn't sew them down as pockets, so I have options later on. This is me just rebinding that so that it's in the middle. I felt like the double bow on the closure and on the binding was just a little bit too much for me. And so I had to redo the work of the binding, but thankfully that 3-hole binding is really simple. So it didn't take too long to get that in order. I'm going to make that just a little bit more scraggly and separate those threads back out to make it a little bit more messy looking. A waxed thread is a great option too, but you can't separate it as easy like this is. So that's my only reason for choosing it on this one. Otherwise, usually for pretty much all my journals, I use a wax thread. And giving those threads just a little bit of a haircut. I like the look when the threads are not all the same length. So the DMC embroidery floss is actually 6 strands of thread put together, and you can separate and just use a couple if you want. For the strength of the binding, I did use all 6, but I'm trimming these so that they look kind of haphazardly put in there, and it just adds to that overall aesthetic. Okay, so I'm very happy with how this is turning out, and so I'll show you a little flip through, and then I'll show you how I actually tie this closure, because I actually end up using the safety pin as a functional element versus just purely aesthetic. So I'm going to do a little flip through. You can see all the pages. They're plain pages overall, but it's just a nice little starting point. It takes out the fear of that blank white page that we so often get. And so by having some text on it or a pattern on some of them, it really does help as you go through. So I'm happy with how this looks on the inside. And even though the one pocket that I put in there is technically upside down, I'll just do a flip up or something in there to make it a little bit more fun. Okay, so I'm going to show you this, how I do the closure. So now this is the front cover. I switched it around. I think it's kind of fun. So I go around the other side. I'm going to lift up the cover and slide that there. And then on this one, I'm going to put it through the safety pin. And my reasoning for doing it on the inside cover is I don't want to cover too much of that element. And then I will slide it under that Sari ribbon and make a little knot there, a little half bow, I should say. And tighten it just a little bit and then leave it kind of loose looking, and it actually comes apart really easy. You just pull on that side and it comes out, which is really nice. So it took a little bit to figure out how I wanted to do that. I'm going to show you again. So basically you create a backwards 4, put the tail end through and leave it as a loop, and then just tighten it and refloof out your ribbon if you want it to. So that's my little book. I hope that you guys were inspired. Maybe make one of your own with this month's freebie or a different one. I hope that you have a great day, and I'll see you next week.